They waved the flags. They wore the hats. They chanted the slogans. But what if I told you the very policies they cheered for were quietly working against them? For years, Donald Trump built his brand on the promise of fighting for the forgotten. American working class families, small-town farmers, and blue-collar workers who felt abandoned by the political elite. The rallies were electric, the speeches full of bold promises. But when the dust settled and the policies took shape, something uncomfortable became clear. The real winners weren't the struggling Americans in red caps. They were the wealthy elite and giant corporations. Behind the fiery rhetoric, decisions were being made that funneled wealth upward, chipped away at safety nets, and left many of his most loyal supporters worse off than before. Today, we're pulling back the curtain to see exactly how that happened. Tax policies that favored the wealthy at the expense of working class Americans is one of the most revealing examples of how Trump's agenda, while marketed as a victory for the average citizen, actually tilted heavily toward those at the top of the economic ladder. In 2017, the Trump administration passed its signature legislative achievement, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. On the surface, this was sold as a massive win for everyone. The message was clear: lower taxes mean more money in your pocket, more business investment, and more jobs. It sounded like a promise too good to pass up. But the fine print told a different story. While there were temporary tax breaks for middle-income earners, the bulk of the permanent benefits went to the ultra-wealthy and large corporations. The corporate tax rate was slashed from 35% to 21%, creating a windfall for big businesses, while many of the individual cuts for working Americans were set to expire after a few years. What happened next wasn't the economic explosion for everyday citizens that had been promised. Companies used their newfound tax savings not to significantly raise wages or create long-term jobs, but to buy back their own stock, an action that primarily benefits shareholders and executives. The wealthiest Americans, who already own the majority of stock market shares, saw their portfolios surge while wage growth for ordinary workers barely moved. For a steelworker in Ohio or a farmer in Iowa, the big change wasn't a better paycheck. It was watching the rich get richer, while their own costs of living quietly climbed. And here's the kicker: many of Trump's most loyal supporters ended up footing the bill in other ways. The tax cuts, by significantly reducing federal revenue, ballooned the deficit by trillions. That deficit became a justification for calls to cut back on programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, lifelines for many in rural, working-class communities. So while there was a short-term thrill of a slightly bigger paycheck, the long-term reality was a shifting of the tax burden and financial risk onto the very people who believed the policy was for them. The psychological effect of this was subtle but powerful. Trump's base often measured success not by what happened in the fine details of policy, but by the strength of his rhetoric and the symbolism of his America First stance. Yet, in practice, the economic structure he reinforced was anything but populist. It was a continuation, even an acceleration, of the same trickle-down economics that have historically concentrated wealth at the top. It's a classic political play: give the working class just enough to feel like they've gained something, while ensuring the true windfall flows to those already at the pinnacle of power. In the end, many of his most devoted followers were left in a paradoxical position, supporting a leader whose policies often undermined their own economic security, while the billionaires and corporate giants who needed help the least reaped unprecedented rewards. This is the quiet contradiction at the heart of Trump's tax legacy. The people who felt they had finally found a champion were unknowingly propping up a system designed to keep them exactly where they are. Deregulation that prioritized corporate profit over worker safety and environmental health reveals another deep contradiction between Trump's populist promises and the lived reality for many of his supporters. Deregulation was framed as liberating American businesses from the heavy hand of government, unleashing growth and creating jobs. It was a powerful rallying cry, especially in manufacturing towns, coal country, and rural communities where federal rules were often portrayed as the enemy of prosperity. But what was sold as freedom for the working man often turned into freedom for corporations to cut corners maximize profit, and shift costs and risks onto the very people who believed they were being helped. The Trump administration rolled back more than 100 environmental and labor regulations. These included limits on pollution from power plants, protections for clean water, and safety rules for oil drilling and mining. To many struggling communities dependent on industries like coal, oil, or logging, the message was appealing: fewer rules mean more jobs. But reality was harsher. Rolling back environmental safeguards often meant worsening air and water quality, which disproportionately affects rural and working class areas. These are the same communities where respiratory illnesses, contaminated wells, and industrial accidents hit hardest, and where access to high-quality healthcare is already limited. For workers, some of the regulatory rollbacks directly impacted safety standards. Protections against harmful chemicals, workplace hazards, and even overtime rules were weakened or delayed. Large corporations, freed from the need to comply with certain safety and environmental standards, often redirected those savings not into better pay or benefits, but into boosting profit margins and rewarding shareholders. The cost of this efficiency was borne in the form of workplace injuries, chronic health problems, and environmental degradation that could take generations to reverse. One of the most striking examples is in coal country, where Trump's reversal of certain mine safety initiatives was celebrated as a way to keep mines open. Yet, the same communities saw rising cases of black lung disease among miners, a preventable condition if stricter dust regulations had been enforced. The same dynamic played out with environmental rollbacks. Short-term economic relief for industries translated into long-term health and ecological crises for the people living in those regions. This is where the gap between political branding and policy outcome becomes clear. Trump's rhetoric cast him as a defender of forgotten Americans, but his regulatory approach consistently elevated corporate needs above the well-being of those citizens. It wasn't about finding a balanced middle ground between economic growth and protection. It was about tipping the scales entirely toward the powerful. In the end, deregulation became another tool for enriching those already at the top while exposing working class Americans to higher risks: financial, health-related, and environmental. The very idea of freedom was reframed to mean corporate freedom from accountability, leaving ordinary citizens with fewer safeguards and fewer options when things went wrong. For many of his supporters, the promised revival of their industries came with hidden costs that won't be fully felt for years, perhaps decades. It is a trade-off that serves the short-term bottom lines of elites while steadily eroding the long-term stability of the communities that believed they were being rescued. Key point number 3, tax reforms that overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy and corporations while offering only temporary relief to the middle and working class exposes yet another way Trump's economic agenda favored the elite on the guise of helping everyday Americans. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was sold as a historic win for the middle class, a plan that would put more money in the pockets of working families, spur job creation, and bring back prosperity to struggling towns. Trump repeatedly promised that the benefits would trickle down, claiming that corporate tax cuts would encourage companies to invest in their workers, raise wages, and expand operations in the United States. But behind the populist rhetoric was a policy structure that heavily skewed toward the wealthy, leaving most ordinary Americans with only marginal or temporary gains. The headline feature of the tax law was the permanent slashing of the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, a move celebrated by Wall Street and large multinational corporations. While this was justified publicly as a way to make American companies more competitive globally, the real-world impact was that corporations used much of their windfall not to hire or increase wages, but to buy back shares and boost stock prices, moves that primarily enriched shareholders and executives. Ordinary workers, especially those without retirement plans tied to the stock market, saw little of this benefit. For individuals, the law provided modest tax cuts for the middle class, but these were set to expire after a few years, whereas the corporate tax cuts were permanent. This meant that over time, the temporary relief for ordinary Americans would vanish, while the structural advantages for the wealthy and corporations would remain locked in. Many working-class families found their extra take. Home pay amounted to just a few dollars a week, a sum too small to meaningfully offset rising healthcare costs, housing expenses, or stagnant wages. Moreover, the tax changes included provisions that disproportionately benefited high-income households, such as increased deductions for pass through income used heavily by business owners, real estate investors, and the wealthy. Trump himself, along with many members of his administration and political allies, stood to gain from these changes. It was a textbook example of policies presented as universally beneficial, but designed in a way that funneled the greatest rewards to those already at the top of the economic ladder. The impact on public services was another hidden cost. By significantly reducing federal tax revenue, the reforms created pressure to cut funding for programs that disproportionately serve lower and middle-income Americans, everything from healthcare subsidies to education funding to infrastructure improvements. In effect, the tax cuts not only concentrated wealth at the top, but also laid the groundwork for shrinking the very safety nets that many of Trump's working-class supporters rely on. Over time, the gap between the rhetoric of a middle-class tax cut and the reality of a policy favoring the rich became harder to ignore. For many of his supporters, the initial boost in take-home pay faded quickly, while the long-term consequences of reduced public investment, corporate enrichment, and widening inequality began to take hold. What was pitched as a plan to empower ordinary Americans ended up as another mechanism to consolidate wealth and power in the hands of an elite few, leaving the very voters who cheered for it facing the same economic struggles, if not greater ones, than before. Key point number 4, the rollback of regulations and protections that disproportionately harm the communities Trump promised to help, reveals a deep contradiction in the America First agenda. One of Trump's signature themes was cutting what he called job-killing regulations, framing them as bureaucratic obstacles that stifled growth, innovation, and opportunity. For many working-class supporters, especially those in rural and industrial areas, this message resonated strongly. They were told that removing these rules would revive factories, bring back cold jobs, and lower costs for consumers. But the reality was far more complex. While deregulation did benefit certain industries, it often came at a steep price for the very communities it was meant to uplift, undermining public health, workplace safety, and environmental stability in ways that created long-term harm. A prime example was the rollback of environmental protections. Trump's administration weakened or eliminated dozens of rules designed to reduce air and water pollution, curb toxic emissions, and combat climate change. The Clean Power Plan, which aimed to cut carbon emissions from power plants, was dismantled in the name of protecting coal jobs. Yet coal employment continued to decline due to automation and market shifts toward cheaper, cleaner energy sources like natural gas and renewables. The environmental consequences, however, were immediate and tangible. Poorer air quality, higher asthma rates, and contamination risks that disproportionately affected lower income and rural communities. These were often the very places where Trump enjoyed overwhelming support, meaning his policies inflicted direct harm on his political base. Similarly, the loosening of workplace safety regulations was presented as a way to reduce burdens on employers. But for workers in industries like mining, manufacturing, and agriculture, the consequences included increased exposure to hazardous conditions, fewer inspections, and weaker enforcement of safety standards. When accidents occurred, or when long-term health problems developed from unsafe working environments, the costs were borne by the workers and their families, not the corporations benefiting from reduced oversight. This imbalance revealed the deeper truth: the deregulation often shifted power further toward large companies while eroding protections for ordinary people. Financial deregulation told a similar story. By easing rules on banks and lending institutions, the administration argued it was promoting access to credit and economic growth. In reality, these moves primarily benefited large financial entities, enabling risky practices that had previously led to economic crisis. For working-class Americans already struggling with debt, predatory lending, and lack of affordable housing, the rollback of consumer protections left them more vulnerable, not less. The long-term damage of these rollbacks isn't just economic, it's generational. Environmental degradation, weakened safety nets, and the erosion of consumer protections all have compounding effects over time, making it harder for communities to recover or adapt. While deregulation may have provided short-term boosts to corporate profits and stock market performance, it did little to create lasting economic security for working-class Americans. What makes this point so striking is the contrast between the promise and the outcome. Trump presented himself as a champion of the forgotten American, someone who would stand up to powerful elites and put the interests of regular citizens first. But in practice, many of his deregulation policies handed more power and profit to those elites, while leaving ordinary people with fewer protections, higher risks, and more instability. It was a bargain that looked appealing in the moment, but proved costly in the years that followed, a pattern that repeated across multiple areas of his administration's policy agenda.